gentlemen, I hope that you can hear me. Welcome to the University of South Wales, to our Newport City campus. I'm Helen Langton and I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you here this evening. A couple of boring but necessary housekeeping things before we get going. I've been asked by the gentleman who's filming the lecture at the back if it's possible to turn phones off, not just to put them on silent. The reason for that is that even if they're on silent, they interfere with the mic, etc. So if it is possible to turn them off, I'd be grateful. Fire exits, we're not expecting a fire alarm of any description, so you can see the exits, one at the back, two at the front. And if you haven't found the ladies and gents, if you go back down into the main corridor towards the front door, and they're on your right. I think that's probably all our housekeeping bits and pieces. So as I say, you're very welcome, and tonight I believe you're in for a real treat. I was just reflecting with Gideon before we got going about how actually both nerve-wracking, exciting, exhilarating and difficult your inaugural professorial lecture is. I remember mine well, and it's a really slightly surreal experience because your audience is not your typical audience. So it's really lovely to be able to welcome some of Gideon's family here. I know we've got his wife, his mum and his sister. They've travelled from various parts, including Edinburgh, to be here tonight. But you don't normally, apart from when you're a teenager, lecture your mum or your dad or whatever. So it's slightly bizarre to have your family in your work context. We don't do that very often. But we've also got academic colleagues, and there'll be a mix of you here. There'll be those of you who work closely with Gideon and in the work that he is involved in, that you're involved with too. You'll be very familiar with some of what he's going to share, I'm sure. There'll be other academic colleagues here who don't work so closely with you, who are here to be supportive and are interested in what's going on. A different level of interest there and a different level of knowledge. And I'm sure you've also got some students here, which is great. If you're here as students, you're very welcome. And then other wider colleagues from other institutions, collaborators from around the city and beyond, enthusiasts, and a very mixed audience. So it is quite a challenge to pitch your lecture. So with that in mind, there are a couple of things that I want to say about Gideon by way of introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to him for his inaugural lecture. So Gideon graduated from the University of York in 1993 with an MA, which I note he got a distinction in political philosophy, having done a first degree in York in 92 in philosophy and politics. After graduation, he did spend some time working in journalism and in a bookshop, but the draw of being an academic was too much. In fact, we've just been talking about the enjoyment of teaching and of imparting knowledge and dialoguing and facilitating learning. And how it's both challenging but also exciting. And he spent some time then as a visiting lecturer at Cardiff University and at Edge Hill, and then he joined the University of Cardiff's Lifelong Learning Centre as a lecturer in 1996 and was there until 2002. And during this time he completed his PhD in philosophy. He joined the University of Wales Newport in 2002 in the School of Health and Social Sciences, first as a senior lecturer, then as a reader in 2007, and took on the role of acting subject leader from 2011 and 12, and was awarded his chair earlier this year, 2014. He's director of the Newport Social Ethics Research Group since 2006, and he teaches and contributes in a variety of ways to university life. His research and his publication is extensive and includes being a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Critical Relations, the Newport City Council Fairness Commission, a trustee and advisor to the Bevan Foundation, a founder and convener of Newport Equality Group from 2010. And in 2014 he was asked by Routledge to co-edit a handbook on social and theoretical issues surrounding childhood, not a small subject as you might imagine. His wide-ranging and substantial research track record is too long to do justice to. In fact, it was fascinating because to learn a little bit more about what you do, I looked at your Twitter feed. So, but there's sorts of really interesting things on Twitter, but just complements what I already know about Gideon in terms of his interest in theory and practice and social justice. So, for example, some tweets around the treatment of minorities, tweets around the benefit system, tweets around threats to workers' rights, tweets around income equality or inequality, and he's clearly a fan of critical argument and debate, which is why I say we're in for a treat rather than a tweet tonight. So I'm really pleased to be able to invite Gideon to come and lecture us on As If, Theory, Values and Real-World Social Justice. Gideon.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for some very generous and, just very generous and obviously very true words of introduction. There's something very self-indulgent about standing in a room full of people you like, getting to talk about things you think are interesting, and I suppose you hope that lecturing will be like that every day of your career, but it isn't always, just most days. But this is an especial kind of treat for me, never mind for you, because it's obviously, as well as being nerve-wracking and a slightly weird experience, it's very gratifying to see so many people who I'm in all sorts of ways very indebted to and have enjoyed working with in different kinds of ways. I think just before I start, I'd just like to say that it's about, as Helen was saying, it's about 12 years since I started as a lecturer at what was then University of Wales College Newport. I started because a guy called David Morgans fell off his bike and did his knee in, and they needed somebody to teach a course on applied ethics at a week's notice in January 2002. And I was in a position to capitalise on David's terrible misfortune. And as a result, I'm still here today, standing before you. I basically inveigled my way in by picking up other bits of teaching and then managed to get myself a permanent job. One of the things about that experience, there's two things to say about it. One is that I found myself in a world which wasn't really the world that I'd been skilled in before. So I was doing a PhD in philosophy, and fairly abstract philosophy, much of it. And yet I found myself teaching in a social sciences setup, which took me in quite a different direction from where I'd originally been. And I've always been very grateful for that, actually, because I think it's probably where I should have always been. And I've adapted myself in ways which I think have really fed into my own work and helped me develop my own interests. And so in all those respects, I'm really very indebted to my colleagues in the department who have, throughout that time, through various changes, and there have been one or two, like 2 changes of the name of the institution, for example, several changes of campus, changes of office, changes of, for a long time, I shared an office with Steve Smith, which, is, I think, actually outlawed in the UN Convention on Human Rights. But in any case, we've had a few ups and downs. Throughout all that time, I can honestly say that I have never ceased to greatly enjoy coming into work. I love the environment that I work in. I get a great deal from my colleagues and also especially the students. I think it's a very lucky working life to have that kind of experience, and it's something which you don't often get the chance, unless you're retiring, to kind of say thank you for. So that's one of the reasons why this is a kind of self-indulgent occasion for me, because I get the chance to say things like that. It's a great working life in lots of ways. I'm also very glad that my mum and my sister and my partner Arabella are all able to be here, because they've never seen me lecturing at all. Now they'll have to believe this is what I do every day. I'm not just like going out in a suit and then working in a newsagent and then coming home at about 6 o'clock. This is actually me and the kind of stuff that I do. I'm not always the biggest sharer of my work with friends and family, so it's quite nice to do a bit of it in that kind of way. I hope they don't think I'm weird at the end of it. I also wanted, ever since I knew I was going to give a professorial lecture, I wanted to have a first slide which looked like a kind of maybe slightly modernist, slightly obscure book of penguin poetry from about 1970. So that's why you have that cover, which is actually completely stolen from a book of penguin poetry from about 1970. In case you're wondering, it has no significance whatsoever. I just thought it would look nice. And I hasten to add that all the subsequent slides as well are done on this basis. They have no significance whatsoever, apart from the one about the Human League, which I will explain shortly, as I now work out how to move on. Okay. I want to talk about social justice, which is something, not a word that I would have used 12 years ago, but it's a word which I've come to realise probably sums up most of the things that I'm interested in. It's also a word which people bandy around in lots of ways without really defining. So it's a word which people increasingly are very familiar with. It's in legislation, journalists use it, it's part of everyday parlance in various kinds of ways. But like many other things like that, things like fairness or justice or equality or whatever, it's a word which is often not really defined or unpacked or explained. So you've got this obviously very significant thing that everybody has a stake in and thinks is like precious and worth promoting without ever really necessarily agreeing what it means, which is an interesting phenomenon about the ways in which ideas and words have a kind of social force, because we can be motivated by something without having really much of a sense of what it actually amounts to. And social justice is one of those words. I hesitate to say this because there are some people like Friedrich von Hayek who doesn't like social justice. But it's a word a bit like freedom in that everybody kind of likes it, but whatever they think that it means. So, why is that significant? It's significant because if you have a word like that, and it matters for academics and for policymakers and for elected politicians and for people doing all sorts of other stuff, then clearly it amounts to much more than what academics ever say about it. So part of what you want to understand when you want to understand what social justice means is what theories of social justice say. But that's hardly the whole story, because anybody would recognize that people contribute to it, whatever it is, social justice, without having the first idea about what theories of social justice actually say. They don't need to have studied them or to have a position on them or to have digested them in a deep way in order to be doing the kind of work which moves us in the direction of a fairer society, for example. So that makes it interesting because it makes it curious to think about how much the academic theory actually matters in a world where people spend relatively little time listening to academics defining social justice, even as they're often doing things which are promoting it. And the things which promote it can happen in all sorts of ways. So it could be, through photography or being a carer or going and seeking out the marginalized in society in various kinds of ways, or just by being a jobbing journalist or in all sorts of other ways. The everyday work that people do help raise awareness of and promote the issues connected to social justice. Again, without this being a concerted plan, without it being something that they agreed to do, and sometimes probably without them even knowing that that's what they're doing, right? So all of this is interesting because it poses a kind of challenge to people who think about social justice, which consists basically of this. What does what they happen to think about social justice have to do, if anything at all, with all those other kinds of things which are going on around the concept in the real world out there? Now, the reason that I thought this would be a good thing to talk about in this context is partly that I think Wales gives you a good perspective on this, because having lived in various bits of Britain, I grew up in Scotland, I lived in the north of England, then the south of England, then in Wales. I've been here for 20 years, which I must say was never the plan, but it's kind of nice here, so I think I'll stick around. But the thing about Wales which marks it out is the scale of the place. So everything the distances tend to be shorter unless you're trying to get from Newport to Bangor. But apart from that, the distances tend to be shorter, the institutions tend to be closer to each other. In a city like Cardiff, you have a cluster of different things which are walkable, which in other cities you need to get on several buses to move between. You have a government which just sits in the middle of town and is accessible and is an open building. All of these things suggest that Wales is a kind of place where you might get a healthier, better kind of dialogue about what social justice is, because the different stakeholders or parties involved in that discussion are literally closer to each other. They're more likely to know each other, to come in contact with each other and to be cooperating. But I don't think it's a good idea to romanticize that or to get carried away with it, because I think it would be naive to think that even in a small-scale environment like ours, there's some amazingly high-quality dialogue going on about what a fairer society is. I think there's the potential for that, but I think that in practice, much of the story is probably fairly similar to what you would find elsewhere. You find bits and pieces of people doing bits and pieces stuff, not necessarily in a concerted way, not necessarily deliberating with each other about what's going on or about what would be the next best move or whatever, but basically just doing stuff. I think that if you look at the level of political engagement, for example, in Wales, it's not necessarily better than anywhere else. And in fact, in some ways, it's worse, because what happens when you look at the Assembly and you recognise how valuable it is to have that kind of devolved government is that you begin to notice that actually the engagement of Welsh society with the work of the Assembly is actually very low. The circulation of the Western Mail newspaper, which is the only newspaper whose job it is to really tell us what's going on in the Assembly, is lower than that of the South Wales Echo, which is the Cardiff evening paper, and the Western Mail serves Wales, right? Its circulation is 22,000. And as I was realising when I was making that point in a footnote in the text which you've got in front of you, the circulation of the Camden New Journal, a North London local paper, is 55,000. So when you think about Wales, geographically, politically, relative to Camden, when you think about the respective readerships of their local papers, you begin to realise that there's a deficit there, there's a gap. It's not necessarily the case that we're in the middle of some thriving, wonderful conversation about exactly how Wales could be, or holding our politicians to account in some fantastically aggressive way. We're not doing anything of the sort. It doesn't mean that there's not the hope for that. It just means that the kind of infrastructure, the kinds of things that would need to be in place for that kind of conversation to be a thriving one, aren't necessarily kicking in. And I think that that's sometimes the fault of academics, universities, sometimes the fault of politicians. It's not necessarily easy to see how you would kind of sort all this out. There's a potential for Wales to be a pretty decent place in terms of how it treats its people and how it has a dialogue about that. It's not clear whose responsibility it is to bring that about, but the way I see it is that people who work in universities and people who theorise about social justice definitely have some thinking to do there. In other words, it can't just be that you satisfy yourself by coming up with a neat kind of theory about what social justice means. You've got to also be thinking about how that might be put into practice, and especially how it might kind of square and tie up with the kinds of real-life social struggles and movements through which social justice is actually, as history always tells us, going to be achieved. It's not achieved by academics sitting behind their desks. Neither, I think, is it a matter that academics define these things and other people go and do them. So it's like, we have a plan for you, this is what social justice is, and then you send your minions out to go and do it. I don't think that's how it works at all, because I think that what people are doing anyway tells you as much about what social justice is as whatever an academic could say about it from the kind of high kind of vantage point of theory. So in other words, I think those two things have to meet, because I think a lot of the times they're like different languages which don't connect with each other. So that's all very easy to say, and I hasten to add that I'm not going to tell you anything about how to sort that lot out in the rest of this lecture. I'm just going to tell you some really bad jokes. No, I'm not. Well, I will actually. I think I can probably guarantee that I'll tell you some really bad jokes, but that's not all I'm going to do. I'm going to take you through a kind of series of stages which are designed to somehow pull off a trick, which is something like describing some of the things I'm interested in, but also in a kind of organised way which will kind of make sense and come to some beautifully coherent end in about 5 hours at this rate. So that's the job of what I'm going to try and do. Some bits I will pass over relatively quickly. You have a piece of text in front of you which is a full, long, drawn-out thing with even more bad jokes in it than you're going to get from me just now, and footnotes and all sorts of things. It's not really finished. I noticed that I didn't put any page numbers in, so I apologise about that. But since there's absolutely no reason, unless you're an insomniac, that you'd want to read beyond page 1, just there's some pages in it. Don't worry about the numbers. Okay. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about some kinds of funny limits that academics put on when they're theorising about things, which I'm going to express in terms of models and codes and kind of what they do for us and what they also prevent us from doing. So that's very much the language of much of academic discourse, and a lot of my work has been about how that's often not a particularly helpful way to progress. And then I want to talk about two senses of the phrase as if, both of which I think are really important for thinking about social justice. You probably know this phrase. You may be thinking about one of them, which is probably the second one, which is the kind of street version of as if, but I'm going to give you another one as well. And I'm basically going to say, you don't want to choose between those, you want both of them. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the work of Richard Rorty, who was the guy who I did my PhD thesis on. He was an American pragmatist philosopher who had lots of ideas about how to engage the public better in certain kinds of debates about what kind of society we want to live in, most of which involved getting rid of what I'm calling big theory, which is the kind of thing that he didn't like. So he thought that a lot of theoretical work was unnecessary, pointless, and basically took you down a big dead end, especially when it comes to social progress. I kind of disagree with him about that, although I'm sympathetic up to a point. Then I'm going to talk about something which sounds probably much more exciting than it looks, although you may feel like one of these by the time I get to this stage of the lecture. And that's to do with, I'm just going to bring the whole thing down to a very particular issue which I think highlights how sensible discussion about the role of theory, and especially theory about values, is really vital. And then I'm going to make some suggestions about how, if we were going to have a conversation about what social justice was going to be like across the whole of society, and we were all going to engage in that, about the kinds of ways we might orientate ourselves to do that. I'm slightly worried because, as anybody who has ever been in any of my lectures will know, they always overrun. I usually am finishing off the previous week's lecture because I actually only just about started it the week before. This is very much the kind of tendency of what I'm doing at the moment, so I'm going to speed up. Okay. Okay. This is an aerial photograph which shows you the difference between the way in which things are designed and how they actually get used in everyday life. There are lots of different versions of this. You can talk to architects about their ideas. For example, you need go no further than this building. Talk to architects about their ideas for how a building will be used, and then compare it to how it actually does get used. Compare the person who designed all of this, which is basically a park setup, and then look at what people have done. They have walked right across, not obeying the rules at all. They've departed from the path that the architect intended for them. If you live in Edinburgh, where I am, there are these housing estates which are like this all over the place. You find them anywhere. They have this beautiful vision of a probably very egalitarian kind of ideal community, and then what happens when you put people in them is that they start walking across the grass bits and going, not using those stairs, but using those ones, and using those stairs as a toilet in many cases, or whatever. And basically, the use of a space is often very different from the way in which it was designed. And there are lots of versions of this. One of the reasons that it's important to me in my work is that I tend to want to start from what some people call lay or everyday normativity. What does that mean? It means that I'm interested in why it is that people value things, the things that they value. So I think as human beings, we tend to value things. It's one of the things that we like most, is to offer value judgments. We do this in all sorts of ways, and we have a tendency to use it as a way both of promoting ourselves, of doing down other people, of enjoying the kind of experience of being different, or as marking ourselves out. There are lots of different versions of it. But the role that values play in everyday life is a fascinating one, because you don't understand human life unless you understand that, basically. So that's been one thing which I've really kind of pushed at in a lot of my own work. We are evaluative, value judgment making beings, and that is important. If you translate that into an academic context, though, one of the things that it often does is encourages people to kind of erect frameworks which are the way that we do things and we understand things, which are often very different from the ones next door, say in a university, but they think are somehow better or superior or the place to start from. So one of the curious things about working in a university is that you think that you'll go there and discover that there's all the clever people who know lots of stuff about the world. What you discover is that there's lots of different versions of the world, because different disciplines, different subjects tend to divide it up in completely different ways. So when you are working in a university, one of the things you notice the most is you have these language problems a lot. So the way you describe an issue or a problem will not necessarily be the same as the department next door, or even the person next door, or even the person sharing your office, or whatever, because we simply come at the world with different frameworks in mind. I think there's a thing about frameworks which makes them inevitable and really valuable. We can't think about the world without having some kinds of systems, models through which to process it. But I think a lot of the kind of stranger things that get thought and said stem from us overemphasizing the value of those frameworks. So I think that models and codes of practice and kind of systems tend to get inflated into the way the world is, rather than being recognized as just a model or a system or a way of speaking about it. And that's actually a really common thing. Why is it common? I think there's two reasons. One is that models shed loads and loads of light. So one of the best things you ever do when you're a student is when you have those moments where a way of talking about the world makes sense to you and you feel like you've got it, and then suddenly it's like a great big beam that you can shine on all sorts of things and will make them make sense to you. And of course, that's much of the value of academic work. On the other hand, they also, what models tend to do is to make us lazy about thinking beyond them, because once you've ingested one and you've got it inside you, it can explain everything. It's all terribly neat, and basically anything that doesn't fit within it becomes inconvenient, much harder to kind of process. So you either have to disregard it or junk your model. Most people, especially when their career depends on it, don't particularly want to junk their model. So we tend to be quite loyal to all kinds of systems of thinking, way beyond the point where it's fairly obvious that they're not really working for us. And there are lots of examples of that. I'm jumping about a bit between these things. One of the really obvious ones is what happens to the dominant model of free market economics after the crash of 2008, which is something that you might have expected to ask rather big questions about the viability of certain orthodoxies in economics. Basically, the world was increasingly run on certain assumptions which turned out to be, for want of a better word, false about the way in which economies work, with actually disastrous effects. If you want to think about how disastrous those effects are, you just need to talk to somebody who works for Newport Council about how they're only about a third of the way through a drastic kind of program of cuts as a local authority, which will probably mean that whatever local authorities are doing in a few years' time is rather less than it is now, and probably much less than any of us are used to or would expect councils to be providing. It's unlikely that they'll be running any parks, for example, in about 4 or 5 years. This might, change the definition of what people think a council is. Anyway, it's not massively simplistic to say a lot of that goes back to the influence of lots of assumptions about the way in which markets worked, which were wrong. They were also the assumptions which anybody who, like me, started learning economics at university in 1989 were just told were the truth, right? So I went to one economics lecture, and then I dropped it. And the reason I went to one economics lecture and then I dropped it was that that economics lecture was about a graph. And that was the whole of a lecture. So I was sitting there like that, one of you, and a guy called David Gilsland, I don't know what he's doing now. I remember his voice forever. I went to one lecture, and he talked like this. And he talked like this about a graph for about an hour. And he said, that's all you need to know about supply and demand. And then we went home. And I thought, when I'd been at school, I had this economics teacher called Mr. Kelly, who was the best teacher ever, and who ran the football team. And my family will know how odd this is in the context of my school. We weren't brought up in a particularly ethnically diverse place, but he was black and gay and ran the football team and taught economics. That's a kind of conjuring trick at Queensbury High School that nobody ever would pull off. He was also just simply the best teacher ever, and he made economics seem like it was about the world, about everything interesting, about any question socially or politically that you could ever thought of. He made it about economics, and he made economics about that. And basically, he made all of those questions seem really vital, and he made them seem like they were about the street outside your classroom. And then I went to a lecture about a graph. And the graph was not about the street outside. The graph was basically as if you could explain the entire social complexity of what an economy is by looking at it in graph representatory form, right? And I thought, right, if that's what economics is, I'm off. And unfortunately, I kind of regret that in a way, because it is often handy to know a lot more about economics than I actually know, especially when you do the kind of work that I do. But on the other hand, I think that tells you a particularly sad story about the way in which certain kind of dominant models come to define not only the way you learn economics in a university, but what does that become? That becomes what we know about economics. So that's what being an expert about economics is. So when you watch the news or when people seek economic expertise, they tend to be trading off the same kind of dominant orthodoxies as you would find in the classroom, and it's all the more depressing for it. Not because those orthodoxies are somehow completely from start to finish fundamentally wrong, but because they're limited, and the people use them as if they're not. They talk about a graph as if it was the world, and it's not, it's a graph. And that's a relief to those of us who don't like graphs much, because there's other stuff in the world as well. Another example of which is a different sort of how a kind of fetishization of models or codes can end up being problematic. I would take from, I've always done quite a lot of professional ethics teaching and have come to write about it as well because I think it raises lots of interesting questions. So I have taught, for example, one of the first things I did when I was trying to get my feet under the table and get myself a permanent job here was volunteer to teach ethics to probation officers. I didn't really know what a probation officer was, actually, so I had to go and look that up. And then I realised what a probation officer was, and I thought, right, what kind of ethical questions does that involve then? And so I turned up and I said, right, I'm going to do utilitarianism, Kantianism, and virtue ethics. And that didn't work out very well. So I worked out that actually what I needed to do to teach ethics with probation officers was to find out what probation officers regarded as the value conflicts that they faced in their work. And blimey, there were an awful lot of them. You know, what do you do with a serial sex offender who you hate, but you're meant to be helping him out? That kind of stuff, you know. What do you do when you're working with a racist? Whatever you like, you know, it's just loads of, what do you do when you haven't got any money, but basically you can see what the right thing to do is, but your resources allocation doesn't allow you to do it, so you have to knowingly do what you know is not the right thing to do because you can't afford to do the right thing. So you talk to probation officers about what their life is like. It's full of ethical dilemmas. And so that made it a whole lot easier. I just based a whole course around what probation officers actually faced in their lives. And one of the most striking things about that was that it didn't have much to do with the codes of ethics which guided their profession. Because the codes of ethics of any profession will say things like, we must treat everybody with respect, and we must recognize diversity, and we must promote equality in our work wherever we can, and whatever. Respect is a great word, because, I mean, who doesn't want to be treated with respect? A code of ethics gives you, however, absolutely no clue as to what it is to treat somebody with respect. So you've got a racist client. How do you treat them with respect? Should you treat them with respect? Maybe you respect them in a different way from your non-racist client. None of this is said by that principle that you should treat people with respect. And so, in a very important way, those codes of ethics are, well, at best, they're something you should leave to the very, very, very end of your course. If you started with them, it would be like climbing a mountain at the top. No, that doesn't work. Something like that. Anyway, it's the wrong place. Let's just say, you can't, you know, if you wanted to get there, you wouldn't start from here or wherever it is they say in Alabama. The point about that is just that you wouldn't learn about the practical ethics of being a probation officer by reading the code of ethics which governs probation work or social work or being a nurse or anything else, because it would tell you really very little about what it was like to be a probation officer or a nurse or a social worker. And what you really need to know to think through all the ethical issues which come up in one of those spheres is to get into that sphere and see what people do there. And then, actually, what's interesting is that you tend to find that the issues do tend to resonate right across different professions. Professions aren't that different from each other. You find that the challenges that people face are very similar to each other in the end, and that often they may use different vocabulary for them and they may describe them in different kinds of ways, but in the end, they're often grappling in similar ways with quite similar issues, and that's a really vital thing to get hold of, because that tells you that it wasn't the rule book which defined the issues, it was the process of practically engaging with them which did. And if you can work out how that gets done in different professions, then you've worked out something much more about ethics than you would ever get by reading the manual, which is effectively what a code of ethics is. So, I'm all over the place here. I've jumped down to there. A point that I meant to reinforce is that academics talk as if their disciplines map the real world. They don't. The world does not give a monkeys about what universities call academic disciplines and is largely indifferent to that. So you think that as a student or as an academic, your own view of the world captures something really distinct. It captures a kind of segment of it. So you study economics or history or religion or linguistics or astrophysics or whatever it is, you're kind of lining up with a bit of the world, and your academic discipline is about kind of locking onto that and explaining it. The world isn't divided into disciplines at all. The world is a great big mess of complexity, and often we reduce it really badly if we think that there's a world of this and a world of that, and there's the world of history and there's the world of linguistics. All of these things are intertwined. What that basically means is that I'm kind of congenitally cross-disciplinary in the way that I work, and I get really impatient. Sometimes I think because of my own limitations or just because of the way I am, but sometimes I think because of a kind of frustration with the way things, just the habits that people tend to get into. I get very frustrated with too much disciplinary territoriality because I think it's simply false. I think that's not the way the world is. And that is a certain way of being a realist. There are lots of different senses of the word realism. Here are two. One of them is to say something like, a realist is somebody who thinks that the way the world is and the way we talk about it or our knowledge of it are two different things. So our knowledge is only ever an approximation to the way things actually really are. And language, discourse, models, codes, they never really capture the way the world is because the world is always more various than that. It has an independence from the way in which we talk about it, which, when you put it like that, sounds like a certain kind of common sense, but philosophically it's actually way controversial because there's been probably much of the mainstream philosophy has actually been questioning the extent to which we can ever talk about a world beyond what we can actually say or talk about or whatever. The other sense of being a realist is the one to which I kind of come more latterly, largely on the influence of the Italian gentleman sitting up there, who people always think is Palestinian, but he's actually not. Just in case you're wondering who the Palestinian guy is sitting up there, it's actually an Italian called Enzo. And Enzo is a full-on political realist, and that means that basically he thinks that when you're doing political theory, you should start, as it were, not from a kind of idealized model about how things should be, but you should start from the reality of how politics is done. Now that again may just sound like a certain kind of common sense, but it isn't, because if you're like me and you went to study political philosophy at university 25 years ago, which is a chilling thought, what you discovered was that you had to learn a new language because political philosophy was nothing to do with politics at all. You thought politics was about things like, struggles for justice and the miners' strike or, apartheid. And actually, you learned political philosophy and it was about the kinds of ideal institutions that we would have if we lived in a completely different society which we had put together in a completely different way in some perfect alternative universe which doesn't exist. That was what most of political philosophy was like. And I've come to realize that there's loads of value in that way of doing things, but it doesn't connect up to what people actually experience as politics in the world around them. And I think that it's actually much more helpful and probably in many ways more authentic to think, what is it that arises politically, and then think, how do we understand and organize that into a set of principles or values, than to start from on top of a mountain pronouncing about the values and then desperately try to clamber down to the street level and say, all right, what's that got to do with this person's grievance about migration or whatever it is. So, summing all this up, models and codes, frameworks, the ways in which academics speak, these are all really useful languages, but they're really limited. And the problem with them is not that they exist or that they're influential at all, it's just that people don't rein them in. They don't recognize the limits of those kinds of ways of speaking and recognize, A, that there are other ways of speaking, and B, that any way of speaking never really captures the full extent of the world around it. Okay. Still catastrophically behind schedule, I move on to slide number 2. I wanted to call my lecture As If because a few years ago I read a book by Blake Morrison which is about the Jamie Bulger murders, and it's called This Murders. There's only one, thank God. And there's something about what he's talking about which is also relevant to what I'm saying, but I'm stealing his title and I'm doing something different with it. I want to say that there are two different ways of thinking about as if, both of which are useful, or two different things that it means. And the first one is summed up by the Human League singer, Phil Oakey. There aren't many things summed up by the Human League singer, Phil Oakey. You may be aware of his work. You're probably aware of the one about the, don't you want me, baby, people arguing about, I was working as a waitress in a cocktail bar, thank you very much, yes. He looked roughly like that, but you'll notice that in this picture he looks very like Brian Ferry. I think that all pop stars in the end probably look like Brian Ferry if they try hard enough. And actually, I'm going to refer to a song where he no longer looked like this anymore, but he looked so much more glamorous and attractive in this picture that I've stuck with this one anyway. Anyway, that is Phil Oakey, singer of the Human League. He's now bald, so I didn't put Phil Oakey now because that wouldn't have quite the same effect. Anyway, a little known and not very often heard late song by the Human League is called Louise, and it's all about a couple who have a kind of chance encounter. They bump into each other. It's not entirely clear what was going on, but the whole thing is depicted as if they're relating to each other as if they were still lovers, right? So there's obviously some previous romance that's gone on, and it's not awfully clear whether they've deliberately met up or whether they've literally met by chance. But anyway, this whole kind of episode happens as if they were still lovers, and then Louise gets back on the bus and disappears, and we never know what happens after that. Now, if you're like me and you like a bit of that kind of thing, it's amazingly poignant. You can't really sing for Loki, but it's very moving in its way. But if you prefer actually more slightly heavy-duty, properly academic-sounding examples, the strapline of the New Economics Foundation, which is an excellent London think tank, one of the few excellent London think tanks in many ways, is economics as if people and the planet mattered. Now, you might think that's a bit of an odd thing to say, because how would you ever do economics as if people and the planet didn't matter? Isn't that kind of what economics is about? Well, if you think back to the graph, and David Gilsland, and this is what the whole of economics is, then you realise that a lot of people do economics as if there was no planet. Let's get your grammar right. There were no people and there was no planet. In other words, the real world doesn't really enter into it. It's an entirely kind of artificial mechanism for thinking about how people make choices and what this does to prices and all the rest of it. A great deal of economics is like that. So it tells you something when there's an economics think tank, which feels the need to have the strapline economics as if people actually existed. That's what the New Economics Foundation does. What does the word as if mean in that sense? Well, it doesn't mean let's make up a completely fantastical world that doesn't exist. It means let's look at the same world in a different kind of way. Let's deliberately decide to have a different perspective on the same thing that we were looking at before. So let's behave as if we were still lovers. Let's do economics as if there was a planet outside the window. That kind of stuff is a deliberate decision to shed light by getting out of your old model or your old framework and putting things under a different kind of lens, if you like. I think that's really vital for reasons that I'll come back to when you're thinking about social justice, because I think that's what social justice largely is. What do? You don't just simply accept that the dominant kind of point of view or orthodoxy about stuff is all there is or where it's at. You basically take a step to one side and you think, imagine if we actually lived in something like a fair society. Wouldn't that be different? That's a vital part of what it is. If you don't do that kind of thing, if you don't do that kind of work, thinking about social justice, you're going to be stuck where you started. Sometimes I think we don't do enough of it, or we don't do it very well, because if you think about it, very abstract theory is often done in that kind of way. It's just that it's such a distance from what anybody could actually latch onto or relate to that it's very difficult for them to actually kind of get to grips with it or apply it to things that they are familiar with. But nonetheless, I think that, it's a vital part of what people do when they're thinking about social justice. And the other version, I'm going to call the clueless version, and you have to watch this clip. Anybody who's been in a lecture of mine will know that this is the bit where it goes horribly wrong. The sound doesn't work. And actually, we get taken to the Tesco's website or something by mistake. But, oh, look. Indeed, we haven't got any sound. We did do when we tried it earlier on. Is there anything I can do about this? Probably not. Yes, put that up there. Okay, that's all right, because all I really need to do is, Okay. Let's do that again with the big screen. And all I want you to do is listen for the two words which are said at the end of this short sequence from a well-known film starring Alicia Silverstone.
Ew, get off of me!
Okay. It should be fairly obvious to you that the term as if there means something rather different from as if we were still lovers, that kind of slightly hopeful kind of sense of, oh, maybe it would be like that again, or imagine the world if it was like this. She's intending to mean something almost entirely the opposite, which is something like, yeah, right. It's like, as if that would ever happen, as if that is in any way a depiction of anything which I would ever do. So as I push this person off me, what am I saying? I'm saying what I'm offended by is the assumption that you even thought I would be up for that. I don't know what it was, exactly. But anyway. What I want to say is that those two senses of the word as if are both really important. In other words, we do a lot of work in this kind of vein where we think constructively about the way the world is. I think we should also do some work at the same time in this kind of vein. And you might be thinking, why? That's a film from 20 years ago, and it's all about a girl pushing a boy away and saying, ugh, as if. But basically, I think that there's a kind of skepticism and a kind of refusal to accept what has just been said in the second version, which is just as important as the dreamy kind of, oh, imagine if the world was like this thing which is going on the left. And I think basically you need a bit of both. Now you might think, well, who would ever say anything different? The way I've just put that probably makes it sound like that's fairly sensible. But to think about why it's important to hang on to both, I think it's quite a good idea to think about a thinker who basically says we should only do the one on the left. I've now got rid of it. We should only do the one on the left and not the one on the right. So it should be all Phil Oakey and no Alicia Silverstone. All New Economics Foundation and no Clueless. That kind of thing. Okay. This parcel was sent to me at an address where I used to live in a house with my sister in Cardiff, down the bottom of Grangetown, just next to IKEA, if you're ever passing. And it's a package which was sent to me by Richard Rorty, who was a very nice guy and used to regularly send me packages of his stuff. I mean, his work, not just random things from his house. That would have been very nice too, but here is my underwear. No, he didn't do that. So I've waited all my life to have a chance to take a photo of this parcel and put it on a slide. So there we go. There's my moment of self-indulgence. Rorty's big thing, I mean, I spent a lot of time looking at his work without necessarily agreeing with very much of it, but he was always a very stimulating thinker to kind of think with, even if you were disagreeing with him. And his big thing is that a great deal of the history of philosophy and a great deal of academic theory in general basically invents problems to which there are no answers, and as he puts it, scratches where it doesn't itch. In other words, they're kind of industries which kind of think up a whole agenda for themselves and now say, right, the job of our discipline is to solve this agenda. But the agenda is it's almost in a bubble all by itself. It's a kind of circular enterprise. So basically he says this about the history of philosophy. He says, people learn philosophy like the ultimate nature of reality and what is truth and what is knowledge, as if those are questions which we're ever going to answer in some kind of big way. It's a kind of fairy tale. It's kind of nice to think that way, but actually it only takes you to a dead end, because in the end it has no function beyond itself. It's kind of like reading stuff for pleasure or a kind of intellectual exercise rather than anything which actually touches on the world at all. And he thinks that a great deal of academic endeavour has been like that because we've been held captive by various slightly odd pictures of the world, which makes us think if only we think right about the ultimate nature of the universe, then we will somehow solve social justice. And he thinks that that's basically a mistake. And there's a great deal to be sympathetic with in his work, especially when you read the stuff which is really complaining about the things theorists do when they disappear up their own backsides, basically, and talk as if their world of theory is somehow the same thing as the real world, or as if, particularly, thinking the right kinds of theory or reading the right kinds of books, usually by French people, somehow makes you a radical, makes you progressive and subversive. And personally speaking, I have some sympathy with that. I think too many people, certainly when I was a PhD student, probably thought that they were changing the world by basically reading Gilles Deleuze or something, and they almost certainly weren't, and they probably now all work as bankers, and everything is exactly as it was. So I think there's a lot in it. He writes a book in 1998, it's actually a series of lectures called Achieving Our Country, and it's all about how progressives in America, basically, in the early 20th century, they all kind of did real stuff. They kind of engaged with the real world, and they organized politically, and there was a kind of a genuine kind of progressive American political movement. But what happened was that the academy kind of stole lots of people away, and that by and large, those same people ended up just kind of sitting around in seminar rooms talking about various concepts which would mean nothing to the world outside, rather than doing anything kind of constructive with their kind of wisdom. And he calls that a kind of spectatorial position. So he thinks that progressives in America gradually became more and more spectators and less participants in the social world around them, and that left, basically his thesis is that basically left things entirely, it's like handing the game over to the forces of non-progressivism, conservatism, the establishment, the status quo, however you put it. So basically he thought that what had happened to academics in that process was that they'd become too much like clueless and not enough like Philoki. Basically they stopped doing things like, here's an alternative vision of the world, which would be great, because that sounded slightly naive and a bit naff and a bit kind of like 19th century. And what you really wanted to do was just go, yeah, right, about virtually everything. So you'd adopt a stance of skepticism about virtually anything that came your way. And thinking radically or progressively or interestingly was always a way of rejecting what the previous thing that everybody thought was. And that was enough to make you kind of good at dinner parties or whatever. I think he's right about that in large measure, except that I think that you need some clueless too. And I think the best way to explain that is to think about what he says elsewhere in his writing about what we should do with our urge to theorize. So you've got to remember, this is a guy who says basically, we've done too much theorizing in general, it doesn't really do anything, the world doesn't care about it, only people who are kind of obsessed by certain works of theory think that they're significant beyond themselves. They basically leave everything else untouched. So he basically says, if you're the sort of person who really likes reading that kind of theory, do it at the weekend, do it for fun, do it like other people read Mills and Boon novels, but don't do it in a way which actually is pretending that it's got any bearing on the world, because when you're engaging in the real world of kind of progressive politics or whatever, what you need to do is speak the language of the street. You need to talk to people as if you're here and now, not from on top of a mountain, but actually engaging with things as they actually are. Now, the problem with that is that is, ironically, when you put those theses together, there's a kind of jarring between them. Because I think there's the problem with saying all of that theoretical thinking in the end is only for the weekend is that it itself is inherently conservative. Because what happens when we have genuine political progress is that ideas which were marginal or not heard or not regarded as being acceptable barge their way into the mainstream. That's by and large how kind of genuine radical change happens. If you say to people that all the difficult weird theory stuff is really something you should hide under your pillow and get out in the middle of the night when nobody's looking because it's slightly naughty, then you're basically stripping away much of the apparatus with which we would criticize the contemporary social world in which we live. So I basically, I might be a theorist who doesn't really like much of the things that theorists do, but I always want to say theory is a vital part, the kind of critical stance that you get from reading unorthodox, unconventional, left field ideas is exactly the sort of thing you need to shine light on the social world around you, and to kind of shove it to the margins, as Rorty actually would prefer that we do, seems to me a really odd thing to do. It's odd for two reasons. One is that you can't, in other words, you can't avoid lots of theoretical assumptions in your work, and this is one of the things which is a particular bugbear of mine, is that often people present themselves as if they're escaping the world of theorizing about stuff, but at the same time as they're doing that, they're making lots of contentious theoretical claims, which is what their supposed escape rests on. In other words, there's no way of being theoretically neutral or just parking it so it doesn't intrude on what you do. There are always theoretical issues about whatever you are doing, and you don't avoid those simply by saying that you've decided not to think about them. They catch up on you anyway. The other thing is that I think you need a bit of Alicia Silverstone, I mean, not literally a bit of her, like her toe or her, liver or something, but just, generally a bit of that kind of stance in public too. I don't think you want to live in a society where everybody is simply somehow dreaming about a better world without also having a very heavy dose of scepticism in it. I think that's absolutely vital. So if the Welsh Government says, we are promoting social justice, people shouldn't be reacting to that by saying, that's great. What a fantastic world to live in. I'm so glad I live in Wales where we promote social justice. They should be thinking, what does that mean? Anyway, why are you doing that? And what's your version of social justice? And why do you think that I should be impressed by that? Absolutely, you should be like that. You should be brushing it off and going, ugh. But not because social justice is a terrible idea, not because you're literally trying to banish it, but because you shouldn't just accept whatever the version of a word like that is. And might I add, Steve would relate to this, my colleague Steve Smith, thinking about working on well-being. Well-being is referred to in Welsh Government legislation as if, of course, it's great. So there's a Social Services and Wellbeing Act fairly recently. Have a look at how it defines well-being and then tell me what it means afterwards. Nobody knows what well-being means in the Social Services and Wellbeing Act because all it basically does, it's about right, isn't it? All it basically does, it says, well, there are various kinds of contexts in which well-being matters and these are some of them, but it doesn't tell you anything about what well-being actually means. So basically it says, well-being, that's great, but we're not going to tell you what it is, and now we're going to have it as a law that we have to promote it. Now that's really weird. To that, you basically respond like this. You say, Not because you don't want the government to be promoting well-being, but because you want the government to have some kind of coherent, fleshed-out theoretical account of what well-being is so that we can actually interpret it and operationalize it. I've got you, Helen. Okay. Helen is telling me to wind up, which I will shortly. Okay. All right. In about 5 minutes, I've just dribbled everywhere. All right, I promise you an example which there's an irony here, isn't there? I've talked in very abstract ways, complaining about people talking in very abstract ways. Here's an example of why it really matters that we can think theoretically coherently about social justice as well as paying attention to the real world around us. All you need to do to think about that is to think about something which is kind of at the heart of my work at the moment, which is the relationship between families and equality. Why does that matter? Because basically most people think that families are, amongst other things, generally quite a good thing. So, families are quite good ways of bringing up kids. They're quite good ways of achieving certain kinds of social goods, of kind of developing and educating people and equipping them for life. It seems small-scale families seem by and large better than being brought up in a warehouse, that kind of thing. People are quite keen on families. And they also think that one of the valuable things about families is that they get to make their own choices. So by and large, one of the things which we are supposed to think is valuable about family life, and this is protected all over the place in legislation and invoked in policy in lots of different ways, is that families get to make their own decisions. So it's not just that the scale of them, it's the fact that they're quite autonomous. They get to decide what happens to, for example, children, and then children get to decide what happens to their elderly relatives or whatever. And that's part of what families do. But then, if you think about the fact that people also tend to value equal life chances, then you have a bit of a problem. Why do you have a problem? Because you'll also find all over the place, in legislation and policy, in people's hearts, some kind of assumption that every child matters equally and that every child should be entitled to an equal start in life, right? So most people, if you say something like, should every child be entitled to an equal start in life, will say, yes. And then if you say something like, should families be able to, at least within reason, make some decisions about how their kids get on and have some influence about how their kids grow up? They will say, yes. The problem is with those two things is that they don't fit together at all. As long as you have family autonomy, you don't have equal life chances for kids. Now that's a real puzzle because most people don't want to dynamite the family, and neither do they want to dynamite equal life chances. But they look like horses that you can't ride at once. Why is that the case? Largely because of this. Because what families do is protect and preserve, often in very pernicious ways, intergenerational inequality. So families hand down privilege from one generation to the next. The kids of rich parents tend to end up rich. The kids of poor parents tend to end up poor. In the real life version of this, I give examples of how that happens, but in fact there are just millions of them. They are legion. There's all sorts of evidence of this. And what's most depressing is that countries like the UK and the US, where you're actually especially likely to hear things like, all children matter equally, are also the countries where there's the biggest intergenerational inequality. In other words, if you are the child of somebody from the wrong side of the tracks, you tend to stay the wrong side of the tracks here, and that's really cemented. And one of the things that does the cementing is family autonomy. Why? Because by and large, what parents tend to do is to do the best by their children by privileging them in all sorts of ways, which basically leave entirely intact the kind of class inequalities that they were born into themselves. Britain is like this, like I say, really in a really bad way. And I'm afraid to say, like in many other cases where there are league tables, if you go up the top of the valleys, they're the very worst places for it. So basically, Blaenau Gwent has the most rigid intergenerational equality of anywhere in Britain. So if you're poor in Blaenau Gwent, it's probably because your parents were poor, and your kids probably will be too. And that's basically just the way that it tends to go. So what's that got to do with all the stuff I was talking about before? Well, clearly, if somebody was telling a story about a society which was really fair, and talking as if we had achieved fairness or social justice, the world would not be like that. It would not be a world in which your family situation had such a drastic impact on how your life went. On the other hand, if we're going to think about those things in a way which does something with them rather than just accepting the fact that there's this horrendous tension between them, then we've got to think a bit like Clueless as well as like Philoki. In other words, we've got to think very skeptically about what it is that families are, and very skeptically about what we think equal life chances are, in order to somehow move on from that at all. You can, of course, just accept that some things are just inevitably contradictory to each other, and say, well, we've got to live with that somehow or other. But it's really unsatisfactory in this case, because most people who support family autonomy don't think that they're supporting the privilege of parents to disadvantage other people's children, but effectively that's what they're supporting. And that sounds disturbing to most people. I was quite pleased with this, because basically the songs that your mother taught me, no offence, Mum, are very likely to be very influential on the way in which the rest of your life goes. Sometimes the early stages of upbringing are what we're talking about here, not just whether people, say, go to university or not. Okay, Helen, I know that you're about to tell me to be really finishing as opposed to just pretending I am, and I will, right? I said something slightly ambitious earlier on, which was that I was going to give some suggestions for how we might have a better conversation about all of this kind of stuff. This is just some suggestions. They are not principles. They are not rules to be followed. They're just kinds of ways of orientating yourself as if you were in a discussion about the common good, about the kind of society we would like to live in, about social justice, fairness, however you want to put it. So let's imagine we were all partaking in a discussion like that. These are the kinds of things that I think people should bear in mind. And this is partly addressed to theoreticians like me, it's partly addressed to members of the public, people in all sorts of professional roles, people who just would in any way aspire to be part of that conversation. So I'm just going to read them out, and then I'm going to stop. And if you want to know what any of them mean, then I could say a bit more about them afterwards. So I think we should listen to people as if this were important as speaking. One of the things which I began to notice when I wrote quite a lot about democracy a few years ago was that, I said I was just going to read them out. Now I'm extemporising. But anyway, was that democracy is almost always about speaking, and it's hardly ever about listening. Nobody ever says you've got to listen to other people. They just say, find ways of raising your voice and making yourself heard, as if nobody had to hear you for this to be the case. And there's lots of interesting stuff there about how listening just gets really neglected. Nobody ever thinks that people have to be good at listening in order for there to be a good conversation going on. But of course they do. It's really vital. If nobody's listening, then you're not saying anything in various senses of the term. Don't speak as if models are the real world. We've done that. Don't speak as if yours is the only language. I'm not thinking there about, English or Welsh or French or German so much as academically don't speak as if your own preferred orientation is the only one available or somehow trumps everybody else's. Don't speak as if the status quo is it, in the sense of just, something that we're inevitably stuck with. Don't speak as if saying social justice actually defines it, which it doesn't. In fact, it, anything but. Don't speak as if any one of theoretical, normative or empirical takes, automatic priority over the others, I think is a missing word there. Don't speak as if knowledge is individual property. It's not something that you own or that you have or that you made yourself. You got it dialogically from other people, and you should acknowledge that when you're handling it, rather than regarding it as something which is something you did all by yourself in a shed, which you almost certainly didn't. Deliberate with others as if they were equal partners, but, and this is a difficult thing to pull off, deliberate with others as if they were equal partners, but don't deliberate with others as if they were equal partners, in the sense that don't assume that somehow everybody's on the same footing or speaks the same language or has the same confidence at engaging with dialogue as you do. Don't be naive or negligent about the drastic effects which social inequality has on people's capacity to partake in any kind of conversation, for example, about the world around them. And treat interruptions to what you're doing, thank you for not giving me any, as if they weren't threats, but as if they were prompts for you to think differently. I think that would be a really good way. That would be a good kind of crib sheet, but it's not a model, because that would contradict everything I said earlier on and make me look very silly. So there we are. On that note, I will stop, except to say that apart from Enzo, if you can guess where that is, I'll give you 20p. I'm going to kill you.
I'm not going to be talking too long. I'm a colleague of Gideon's. My name is Andrew Thompson. I'm the head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. It falls on me to offer the thanks for Gideon for a wonderful inaugural lecture, and of course to thank you too for coming along this evening to share this occasion. Gideon, I'm going to say, I don't know what impressed me more, your ability not to keep the time and transgress every rule of an inaugural lecture, the content of it, or the way in which you held a wine glass throughout the entire lecture. Short of a cigarette and a few rants about religion, I was transported back to my childhood in Belfast and watching Dave Allen on TV. It was uncanny, but he was better than me, Gideon. For seasoned professionals and performers alike, these occasions are a trial. You think there might be nothing more straightforward than delivering another lecture. This is, of course, the stuff, basic stuff we've been doing throughout our careers. But the inaugural lecture is not just another lecture. And that's in large part because of the need to speak to a diverse audience of specialists and non-specialists alike, of colleagues and students, of family and friends. I'm sure you'll agree with me that Gideon pulled this off with considerable aplomb this evening. Scholarly, yet grounded, to use a phrase we've heard this evening, in the real world. Public, yet also personal. And I, for one, am deeply enriched by the image of Gideon now as a young Phil Oakey. Objective and analytical, yet also designed to provoke not just thoughts, but actions too. Gideon has spoken this evening of the value of the virtue of good listening. As I've sat here this evening listening to Gideon, I've been reminded of the value of practicing what he has preached. I have got to know Gideon very well over the course of the last 18 months, and I was aware of Gideon's reputation in his work before our union of our two former universities, but it has been one of the great benefits of this recent change to get to know Gideon a lot better. And Gideon, I've got to say that sometimes knowing when to listen is inevitably guided by the knowledge that what you're going to hear is going to enrich you for having done so. It's been the case definitely over the course of the last 18 months. It's been very much the case this evening. I know I'm not alone in that particular thought. So once again, Gideon, a pleasure listening to you this evening. I've greatly, greatly enjoyed it. I'm sure you all have too. So.